Joel had driven through enough remote Alaskan towns to know what they were supposed to look like, and this one was not it. He had been assigned a routine compliance audit by the Alaska Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, and the paperwork made the place sound like every other small community he had assessed over the years. The assignment had come through on a Tuesday with a 2-day turnaround expectation, and a file so thin he read it twice thinking he had missed something. He had not missed anything. It was a standard readiness check. Verify emergency supplies. Confirm communication infrastructure. Document anything that fell outside compliance parameters. And submit a report by end of week. He had done the same audit in 14 different towns across the state, and it had never taken more than 2 days. He packed for 2 just out of habit. The drive and change his impression of the place before he even reached the town limits. The road north was straight and flat, and his truck compass started pulling west somewhere around the 40-mile mark. He tapped the dashboard twice the way a person does when they suspect a simple fix. The needle drifted back for a moment and then pulled west again. He made a mental note and kept driving. The landscape on either side of the road was dense spruce broken occasionally by frozen creek beds that caught the low winter light and threw it back silver. It was the kind of country that reminded a person how much of Alaska existed without any acknowledgement of the people living in it. He had always liked that about the work. The remoteness never bothered him the way it bothered some of the other contractors he knew. He found it clarifying. The first thing he noticed when the town came into view was the architecture, and it stopped him before he had fully processed why. He pulled the truck over at the top of the last rise before the road dropped down into the valley and sat there for a moment looking. The homes were wrong. Not wrong in a way he could immediately name, but wrong in a way that a thing looks when it has been built for a purpose other than the one you are expecting. They sat low to the ground with a deliberateness that was not aesthetic. Their walls were thick enough that the window frames looked like they had been cut through stone rather than framing. Several of the structures were partially sunk into the hillsides behind them, as if they had grown out of the earth rather than been placed on top of it. A dark rubber membrane was stretched across the exterior of most of the buildings, and it caught the flat winter light in a way that made them look sealed. Not finished. Sealed, like something that was not meant to be opened from the outside. He pulled back onto the road and drove down into town. He started his compliance interviews that afternoon, and the inside of every home he walked into confirmed what the outside had suggested. These were not standard builds. The walls were layered in a way he had not seen before with materials he did not recognize from standard construction. He glimpsed what looked like mylar sheeting beneath the interior surface of one wall when a section of drywall had been left unfinished near a doorframe. The pantries were deep and deliberately stocked. Not the casual accumulation of a family that bought in bulk, but a considered and methodical inventory that suggested planning over years rather than months. Water storage was built directly into the infrastructure of the homes rather than added as an afterthought. Medical supplies were present in every household he visited, and they were organized with a precision that went beyond a well-stocked first aid kit. He saw prescription medications stored in labeled containers, surgical supplies still in packaging, reference manuals for field medicine sitting on shelves next to the kind of equipment that belonged in a clinic rather than a kitchen cabinet. He asked the same questions he always asked, and the residents gave him answers that were technically responsive and entirely uninformative. They were polite in the way that people are polite when they have decided in advance how much they are going to say. Nobody was hostile. Nobody was evasive in an obvious way. They just answered the question he asked and nothing more, and when he tried to follow up, they found ways to land on different ground without appearing to redirect him. He was good at interviews. He noticed the redirection every time, and it told him as much as a straight answer would have. He walked back to his truck after the third visit of the afternoon and stood in the road for a moment. A dog was sitting in the center of the road, 20 feet ahead of him. It was not doing anything. It was sitting perfectly still with its nose pointed north and its eyes fixed on something in the middle distance that Joel could not identify. Its owner came out of the house to the left and walked past the dog without looking at it or calling to it. The dog did not move. Joel watched it for a moment and then got in his truck. He found a room at a small guest house on the main road run by a woman who told him breakfast started at 7 and that the Wi-Fi was unreliable this time of year. He thanked her and carried his bag up to the room. The streetlight outside his window was flickering, not the random flutter of a failing bulb, but something more rhythmic that he could not quite resolve into a pattern no matter how long he watched it. He gave up and opened his notebook. He tried to call Claire before he started writing. The call dropped the first time before it connected. The second time it rang twice and dropped. The third time it did not connect at all. And he set the phone down and told himself it was the remoteness of the location. He and Claire talked every few days, and the missed call sat within the quiet of the room longer than it should have. He wrote down everything he had noticed since the county line and read it back when he was done. The compass, the architecture, the supplies, the mylar, the medical equipment, the dog, the streetlight. He read it twice and none of it was individually alarming. Together it felt like something he did not have a name for yet. He looked out the window before he turned off the light, and the northern lights were sitting low on the horizon in ribbons of pale green and white that were brighter than they had been when he arrived. He was not an expert in aurora patterns, but something about their position felt off to him in the same way the compass had felt off and the architecture had felt off. He made a note to ask about them in the morning and went to sleep with the feeling that the town had already decided something about him that he had not yet decided about itself. He was up before 6 the next morning and outside before the guest house owner had started breakfast. The northern lights were gone, but the sky was the wrong color for dawn. It sat in a shade between gray and green that he had not seen before, and he stood on the front step of the guest house for several minutes trying to decide if it was a weather phenomenon he simply had not encountered this far north or something else. He decided it was weather and went back inside. He poured himself coffee from the carafe the owner had left on the counter and sat at the small table in the common room with his notebook open. He had 4 more households on his list for the morning and 2 community buildings to assess in the afternoon. He wrote down the things he wanted to follow up on from the previous day, and the list was longer than it usually was at this stage of an audit. He was not someone who ignored things that did not add up. It was a quality that made him good at the work and occasionally made him difficult to work with. He had been told both things by the same supervisor in the same conversation. He circled the item about the mylar sheeting and wrote a question mark next to the medical supply inventory and underlined a note about the water infrastructure. He finished his coffee and went out to start the morning. The second day of interviews confirmed everything the first day had suggested. The supplies in each home were not just deep, they were coordinated. The same categories of medication appeared in household after household. The same types of water filtration. The same categories of preserved food organized in the same general sequence. It was not the coordination of people who had compared notes casually over years. It was the coordination of people who had been working from the same list. He did not find the list. He did not expect to, but its existence was written into every pantry and storage room he walked through as clearly as if it had been taped to the wall. He finished his last morning interview and stood on the front step of the house he had just left and looked down the main road. The town was quiet in the way that small towns are quiet, but underneath the quiet there was something else, a quality of attention that he felt rather than observed. He had the distinct impression that the town was aware of him in a way that went beyond the normal awareness a small community has of a stranger passing through. He was being tracked. Not followed, not watched from windows, just tracked the way a person tracks, something moving at the edge of their peripheral vision, without turning their head to look directly at it. He went back to the guest house and ate the sandwich he had packed, and opened his laptop He had a signal weak enough to make loading anything a patient's exercise, but he managed to pull up the building permit records for the town through the state database. What he found confirmed the materials list he had been noting in each home. The permits had all been filed within an 18-month window several years back. Same contractor listed on every one. Same unusual material specifications running through every application. Whoever had designed these buildings had designed all of them, and they had done it at the same time with the same purpose in mind. He sat back and looked at the screen for a moment. Then he opened a new page in his notebook and started writing faster than he usually did. He closed the laptop when the signal dropped entirely and sat for a moment in the quiet of the guest house common room. The owner had gone out, and the building was still in a way that old buildings in cold climates tend to be still. He could hear the wind moving outside, but nothing else. He picked up his phone and tried Claire again. The call connected this time for almost 4 seconds before the line went flat. He set the phone down and did not try again. Outside the window, the sky had shifted during the afternoon, and the northern lights were back. It was not yet dark. They had no reason to be visible at this hour and at this intensity, and he stood at the window and watched them for a long time before he went back to his notebook and wrote down the time and what he was seeing and added it to everything else he did not yet have a name for. The building permit records were the first concrete thing Joel had found, and he was not done with them. He was at the desk in his room before the sun came up on the third morning with the state database open on his laptop and a fresh page in his notebook. The permits told a story that the residents had been careful not to tell him directly. Every structure in town that had been modified or rebuilt in the last several years carried the same contractor name on the application. The materials listed were not standard residential construction: reinforced concrete cores, thermal mass layering, waterproof membrane exteriors, subgrade foundation extensions that on a normal build would indicate a basement, but on these structures indicated something closer to a bunker integrated into the hillside. The applications had all been filed within the same 18-month window and approved without comment by a county office that Joel suspected had not looked closely at what it was approving. He wrote the contractor name in his notebook and circled it. He would look into it when he had a better signal. He closed the laptop and went out to start his second round of interviews. The morning went the same way the first day had gone, except that Joel was listening differently now. He was not listening for what people said. He was listening for the shape of what they did not say. Every resident he spoke to gave him answers that were complete enough to pass a compliance review and empty enough to tell him nothing about why the town looked the way it looked or why every household had been built and stocked to the same specification. He asked one woman directly why her home had been constructed with such unusually thick walls. She smiled and said her husband had always been particular about insulation. He asked a man in his 60s why his water storage exceeded the state recommendation by a factor of 4. The man said he had grown up without running water and old habits died hard. The answers were not hostile. They were just walls built as carefully as the homes themselves. He was walking back toward the main road after his fourth interview of the morning when he noticed the birds. A line of them sat on the power line, running along the north side of the road. There were perhaps 30 of them, different species sitting together in a way that birds of different species did not usually sit together, and every one of them was facing the same direction, not toward the sun, not into the wind, north. He stopped and looked at them for long enough that a man coming out of the hardware store across the road noticed him standing there. The man followed his gaze up to the power line and then looked back at Joel without any particular expression and went inside. Joel filed away with everything else and kept walking. He found the building records office in a small annex attached to the town hall and spent an hour going through physical permit files that predated the digital records. What he found pushed the timeline back further than the database had shown him. The unusual construction had not started several years ago. It had started almost a decade ago, slowly at first, 1 or 2 properties, then accelerating. Then the 18-month window where the whole town seemed to rebuild itself at once. Someone had been planning this for a long time before the building started. He was sitting in the parking lot of the town hall, writing in his notebook, when a man he had not spoken to yet came up to his truck and knocked on the window. Joe rolled it down. The man was somewhere in his mid-50s with a broad face and the kind of stillness that some people carried when they were holding something back by conscious effort. He told Joel that the audit had run its course, and it was time to file the report and head back. Joel said he still had interviews on his list. The man said the town had been cooperative and there was nothing left to see. Joel asked him what he was actually worried about. The man looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not anger and was not quite fear, but sat somewhere between the two in a place Joel did not have a word for. He said there was not enough time to explain it to someone who was not ready to hear it. Then he walked away without waiting for a response. Joel sat in the truck for a long time after that, turning the sentence over. He learned the man's name was Brent from the guest house owner that evening. He learned that Brent had lived in the town his whole life and had been one of the first to begin the unusual construction on the property. He learned that Brent was not someone who got easily rattled. The owner said it without elaborating and changed the subject when Joel tried to follow up. He also learned that evening that there was a scientist in town, a man named Walter who had grown up there and come back after years working for a research institution, whose name the owner mentioned and then seemed to regret mentioning. Everyone in town knew Walter. Everyone in town seemed to defer to him in the way that people defer to someone whose judgment they have decided to trust completely. Joel asked if he could meet with Walter as part of the audit. The owner said Walter was very busy, but she would pass the message along. Later that evening, Joel was crossing the main road on the way back from the hardware store, where he had been asking about the CB radio setup the town used for emergency communication. The hardware store owner had been helpful up to a point, and then had become very interested in something on the shelf behind him. Joel had noted the CB units on the counter and noticed that the two sets sitting side by side were giving readings that did not agree with each other. He had asked about it casually, and the owner had said the equipment was due for calibration. Joel had written it down. He was crossing the road when he glanced toward the far side and saw a figure standing at the window of a house set back slightly from the others. An older man, standing completely still, looking directly at Joel across the distance of the road. Joel looked back. The man did not move or look away. Joel took 3 more steps and looked again, and the window was empty. He stopped a woman on the sidewalk and asked whose house that was. She said it was Walter's and kept walking. Joel stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the empty window. That night, he tried to call Claire. The call connected for a few seconds, and he heard the tail end of something that sounded like a news broadcast before the line dropped. He called back immediately and got nothing. He told himself he would try again in the morning and sat down at the desk. His phone compass was showing 4 degrees west of where it should have been pointing. He checked it twice against the window orientation he had confirmed on his first day, 4 degrees. He wrote it down. The northern lights outside were brighter than the night before and sitting lower on the horizon, and he was no longer telling himself it was normal. He went to bed that night with the invitation to dinner at Owen and Celia's place, sitting on the corner of the desk where the owner had slipped it under his door while he was out. A handwritten note on plain paper with an address and a time and nothing else. He had not met Owen and Celia yet. They were on his interview list for the following morning. He was not sure how they knew he would be available for dinner or why they had decided to invite him. He was also not sure he would have declined, even if he had a reason to. After what Brent had said to him in the parking lot, he wanted to understand what kind of town this actually was. not from the permit records or the supply inventories or the hardware store CB units giving mismatched readings from the people in it. He wanted to sit at a table with someone who lived here and watch how they talk about the place they had built together and see what he could read between the lines of whatever they chose to tell him. He fell asleep with the northern lights doing something outside his window that he was no longer going to describe to himself as weather. He did not have a better word for it yet. He was starting to think he might need one. He had also noticed on his way back to the guest house that the Bush pilot he had passed near the airstrip that morning had been standing beside his plane with a GPS unit in his hand, staring at it with the expression of someone who had been given directions to a place that did not exist. Joel had asked him if everything was all right. The pilot had said his GPS had rerouted him to a heading that made no sense on his last run, and he had corrected manually using landmarks. He said it like it was a minor inconvenience. Joel had written it down like it was not. The following morning, he was up early and back at it before most of the town had stirred. He had 5 names left on his interview list, and he worked through 3 of them before noon. The pattern held. Well-stocked, carefully built, politely unhelpful. The 4th interview was with an older man named Vernon, who lived at the end of a short, unpaved road off the main street. Vernon let him in without hesitation and answered the standard questions without resistance. He was somewhere in his late 70s and had the manner of someone who had lived long enough to find most situations more interesting than alarming. When Joel asked about the construction of the home, Vernon started to say something and then stopped. He looked at Joel with a careful expression and started again with a different sentence. The second sentence was about the weather. Joel had seen redirections before, but this one had a quality to it that the others had not. Vernon had not redirected because he was hiding something on instinct. He had redirected because he had started to say something specific and then decided against it at the last moment. The decision had been visible on his face for just long enough to be unmistakable. Joel thanked him and left and wrote down what he had seen on the walk back to the road. It was the most human and unsettling moment of the entire audit so far, because it told him that at least one person in this town had almost said something true and had chosen not to, which meant there was something true to say. He had 1 interview left for the afternoon and a community building to assess and a dinner invitation sitting on the corner of his desk. He walked the rest of the way back to the main road with the particular focus of a person who has decided to stop looking at individual pieces and start looking at the shape they make together. He filed his afternoon notes and changed his shirt and walked to the address on the handwritten note as the last of the daylight left the sky and the northern lights came back brighter than they had been the night before. Owen and Celia lived in one of the more heavily modified homes on the east side of town, and Joel noticed the exterior before he knocked. The rubber membrane on the outer walls was newer than most of what he'd seen elsewhere, and the way the structure sat against the hillside behind it suggested the subgrid extension, when deep in the permits had indicated for comparable properties. He knocked and Owen answered, and the warmth that came out of the house with him was the kind that came from a well-insulated space rather than an overworked furnace. They were gracious hosts in the way that people are gracious when hospitality is something they take seriously rather than perform. Celia had made food that suggested she had planned for a guest, and their daughter Lily sat at the table with the quiet watchfulness of a child who had learned that adult conversations contain more information than adults usually intended to share. Joel liked them immediately, which made the evening more complicated than it might otherwise have been. He asked about Walter early in the meal, and Owen and Celia exchanged a look that lasted less than a second but contained an entire conversation. Owen said Walter would be available to meet with Joel tomorrow, and Celia said he had been very busy lately and left it there. Joel mentioned the confrontation with Brent in the parking lot, and neither of them seemed surprised. Celia said Brent had been under a lot of pressure and did not elaborate. The answer was so carefully shaped that it told Joel more than a longer explanation would have. Brent was not someone who cracked easily, and whatever pressure he was under was understood and acknowledged by everyone at this table, without needing to be named. Joel was making a mental note of that when the earthquake happened. It was small, a brief loosening of the ground beneath the house that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and produced a low sound more felt than heard. Joel put his fork down and looked at Owen and Celia. Neither of them had stopped eating. Celia reached for the serving dish in the center of the table to steady it out of habit rather than alarm, and then let go of it when it settled. Lily looked up from her plate and found her father's eyes. Owen gave her a small nod that was so quick and practiced it was almost invisible. Lily looked back down at her food and picked up her fork. Joel watched the whole exchange and said nothing. After dinner, he walked back to the guest house and stopped twice on the way. The first time was in front of an older building near the center town, where a crack in the exterior foundation wall looked fresh enough that the exposed concrete inside it was still pale rather than weathered. He crouched down and looked at it, and then stood up and kept walking. The second time he stopped was in front of the hardware store, where he had spoken to the owner the previous day. The store was closed, but through the window, he could see the 2 CB units still sitting on the counter. Both of them were on. Both of them were showing directional indicators on their small displays. The indicators were pointing in different directions. He stood at the window for a long moment, and then walked the rest of the way to the guest house. He sat at the desk and opened his laptop and searched for information on geomagnetic polar drift. The signal was bad enough that pages loaded slowly, but he had patience for it. What he found was not obscure or hidden, or the product of fringe sources. It was documented and peer-reviewed, and had been written about in mainstream science publications. The magnetic North Pole had been drifting for decades. The rate of drift had been accelerating. Researchers had been tracking it with increasing attention, because the acceleration was beyond what historical models had predicted. Some papers used careful language about the implications. Some used less careful language. He read for 2 hours, and when he stopped, he sat back and looked at what he had written in his notebook during the reading, and the list was long, and the items on it connected to things he had already written down over the previous 2 days in ways he could no longer dismiss as coincidence. He tried to call Claire before he went to bed. The call did not connect. Not a drop, not a ring, just silence on the line, as if the number he was calling did not exist. He held the phone for a moment and then set it on the desk and looked at it. He told himself the signal was unreliable this far out. He had been telling himself that since the first night. He was finding it harder to believe. He undressed and got into bed and lay in the dark, listening to the wind outside. Somewhere in the direction of the tree line behind the guest house, there was a sound he could not identify. Not an animal sound, not a mechanical sound. Something low and intermittent that did not repeat at regular intervals but kept returning at the edge of his awareness every time he was close to sleep. He got up after the third time and went to the window. The aurora was covering the entire sky. Not the ribbons and curtains he had been watching over the previous 2 nights, but a full canopy of shifting light from one horizon to the other in colors that had no business being there. Deep red bleeding into violet, bleeding into a green, so saturated it looked artificial. He stood at the window for a long time. The sound from the tree line had stopped. He became aware that the guest house owner was standing on the front step below his window. He pulled on his jacket and went downstairs and out the front door. She was looking up at the sky with an expression he could not fully read in the aurora light. He stood beside her and looked up, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said he should probably plan on staying a few extra days. She said it quietly and without looking at him. He said he would think about it, and knew as he said it that he was not going to leave. Not yet, not until he understood what he was looking at. He went back upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and opened his notebook to a fresh page. At the top of the page, he wrote one question, and underlined it twice. Then he closed the notebook and tried to sleep and did not manage it for a long time. He was awake before 4 and gave up on sleep entirely around 5. He made coffee from the small setup in his room and sat at the desk with his notebook open to the page with the underlined question. The question was simple. He had written it in the plainest language he could manage because plain language was how he thought when he was trying to be honest with himself about something. The question was whether all of these things were connected, or whether he was a person who had been alone in a strange town long enough to start building connections that were not there. He sat with that for a while. He had been in strange towns before. He had done audits in communities that were insular and uncommunicative and organized in ways he did not immediately understand. He had learned over the years to distinguish between the instinct that came from pattern recognition and the instinct that came from isolation, making a person feel significant. He believed he could tell the difference. He believed the compass and the birds and the permits and the CB units and the earthquake and the aurora and Brent sentence and Vernon's redirected sentence and the mylar on the walls and the medical supplies in every kitchen and the pilot's GPS and the dog facing north and Claire's line that would not connect were not a person alone in a strange town building something out of nothing. He believed they were a pattern. He did not yet know what the pattern was the shape of, but he believed it was there. He wrote that down too, and then closed the notebook and waited for morning to come and for whatever Walter was going to tell him when they finally sat across from each other. The northern lights were still faintly visible when the skies started to lighten, and that alone was enough to make him stop at the window again before he went down for breakfast. An aurora visible at dawn was not something he had experienced before. He was not sure it was something that happened under normal circumstances. He added it to the list in his notebook and went downstairs. Breakfast was quiet. The owner was not her usual steady self. She moved through the kitchen with a distraction he had not seen in her before, and twice she started to say something and stopped herself in a way that reminded him of Vernon the previous day. He ate without pushing her. After breakfast, he went back to the hardware store. He wanted to look at the CB units again in daylight and asked the owner a direct question about the readings. The store was open, but the CB units were not on the counter where they had been the night before. He asked the owner where they were. The owner said he had moved them to the back for recalibration. Joe asked when they had last been calibrated. The owner said recently. Joe asked when recently was. The owner said he would have to check the log. He did not offer to check the log. Joel thanked him and left. On the walk back to the guest house, he passed a woman he had interviewed on the first day. She was standing on her front step looking at the sky with a thermos in her hand. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning" back without looking at him. She was looking at the sky with the same expression the guest house owner had worn at the window the night before. Not alarm. Something quieter than alarm. The kind of expression a person has when they are watching for something they've been told to expect. He kept walking. Back in his room, he sat down and wrote Lily's question in his notebook. He had almost missed it at the dinner table because Owen had moved so quickly to redirect the conversation. But he had caught it, and it had stayed with him through the night in a way that small things stay with a person when the small things turn out not to be small. Lily had looked at her father during a lull in the conversation and asked in the tone of a child asking about something already discussed many times before whether it was almost time. Owen had changed the subject without hesitation and without looking at Joel. Joel had looked at his plate and said nothing and filed it with everything else. In the notebook, it sat at the bottom of a long list and somehow carried more weight than anything above it. He was still sitting at the desk when his laptop clock reset itself. Not by seconds, by 11 minutes. He stared at the new time on the screen for a moment and then checked his phone. His phone showed the same new time. He wrote it down and sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought about all the things on his list that he did not yet have a word for and how many of them he was going to be able to explain to a supervisor when he filed a compliance report that recommended further investigation, without being able to say clearly what he was recommending further investigation of. Joel did not need an alarm. He was awake before 5 and sitting at the desk with his notebook open when the first thing happened. Every device in the room reset at the same moment. His phone screen went dark and came back showing the wrong time. His laptop shut itself down and restarted with a timestamp that did not match the clock on the wall. The clock on the wall had stopped. He sat very still for a moment and then went to the window. The sky outside was not dark. It was not dawn either. It was something between the two that had nothing to do with the time of day. The aurora was covering everything from one edge of the sky to the other in a way that made the word aurora feel insufficient. It was not ribbons or curtains or the pale shifting green he had been watching for days. It was a full ceiling of moving light in colors he did not have names for. Deep red that was almost black at its edges bleeding into a violet, so saturated it looked solid. Green that pulsed in waves from north to south, like something breathing. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he got dressed and went downstairs. The guest house owner was not in the kitchen. The front door was standing open. He went out onto the step, and the cold hit him hard and clean, and he stood there looking at the sky and feeling something he recognized as the specific quality of a moment that is going to divide a life into before and after. He went back inside and tried to start his truck. He turned the key 3 times and got nothing. Not a click, not a cough, nothing. He got out and stood beside it and looked down the road. Several of the townspeople were already outside. They were not panicking. They were not running. They were moving with the calm efficiency of people executing a plan they had practiced. Doors were closing. Exterior shutters he had not noticed before were being pulled across windows and latched from outside. Families were moving between houses in ones and twos, carrying things. A child passed him on the road, pulling a small wagon loaded with sealed containers, and did not look at him. Joel stood beside his dead truck and watched and felt the specific helplessness of being the only person at a rehearsal who had never been given the script. Walter appeared at the end of the road. He was moving faster than Joel would have expected from a man his age, and he was carrying an instrument case in one hand and checking something on a handheld device with the other. He looked up and saw Joel and changed direction toward him. Up close, Walter was not the composed and distant figure Joel had been building in his imagination for 3 days. His hands were steady, but his eyes were doing something different. They were moving, checking, rechecking, the eyes of someone running calculations that kept coming back wrong. He said they needed to talk and did not wait for Joel to agree before he started. He spoke carefully and without any of the dramatics that the situation might have justified, and somehow the absence of dramatics made it worse. He explained that the geomagnetic poles have been accelerating in their drift for years. He explained that he had been tracking the data from this location for most of his adult life, because this particular position gave him access to readings that were more precise than what was available through the standard network of monitoring stations. He explained that the rate of acceleration had crossed a threshold he had been watching for, and that the crossing had happened faster than his most aggressive models had predicted. He explained that a rapid pole shift would temporarily collapse the magnetic field, and that during that window the planet's surface would be exposed to solar radiation in a way that the current human population had no natural resistance to. He explained that a coronal mass ejection striking the exposed grid during that window would cause transformer failures at a scale that could not be repaired in any time frame that mattered for the people who needed the grid to survive. He explained that he had not gone public with what he knew, because going public would have caused a panic that killed as many people as the event itself before it even arrived. He had told the people in his town. He had told a network of prepper communities he trusted with the information and the timeline. He had done what he could with what he had. He was midway through the next sentence when he stopped and looked at the handheld device and said they were out of time. He said it the way a person says something they've been dreading saying for years, flat and precise, and without room for negotiation. Owen appeared at Joel's shoulder. He did not ask questions. He said they needed to get inside and put a hand on Joel's arm, and Joel went with him because there was nothing else to do. Celia was already inside when they got to the house. Lily was sitting in the interior room with a book open on her lap. She looked up when Joel came in. Then she looked back at her book with the composure of a child who had been prepared for this day so thoroughly that the day itself held no surprises for her. Joel stood in the interior of the house and looked at the walls. The mylar lining beneath the surface caught the light from the lantern Celia was setting out and threw it back in flat sheets. The deep pantry was visible through the open door of the storage room, the water tanks built into the wall, the medical supplies organized in labeled rows on the shelving unit beside the door. He had audited this house 3 days ago and written down everything he saw and understood almost none of it. He understood all of it now. Walter arrived 20 minutes later and sat down across from Joel and finished what he had started saying on the road. He answered every question Joel put to him with the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time to finally tell the truth to someone who needed to hear it. Outside, the aurora had turned the sky a color that Joel was not going to be able to describe to anyone who had not seen it. He could feel a vibration in the ground that reached him in his back teeth before it reached his feet. He thought about Brent standing in the parking lot, telling him there was not enough time to explain it to someone who was not ready to hear it. He understood now that Brent had not been cruel or dismissive. He had been precise. He thought about Claire, about the call that would not connect, about the 2 seconds of news broadcast he had caught before the line went dead. He did not say any of it out loud, because there was nothing to say that would change anything, and Walter was still talking and Joel was still listening, because listening was the only useful thing left to do. Walter finished and sat back, and the room was quiet for a moment. Then the power went out, not just in the house. Joel could tell from the quality of the darkness outside the shuttered windows that it was not just a house. The aurora light coming through the gaps in the shutters was the only light source left, and it moved across the walls in slow shifting waves of red and violet, while the room held its breath around him and the world outside became something entirely different from what it had been that morning. Nobody spoke for a while after the power went out. Owen got up and checked the shutters on the interior room door and came back and sat down. Celia poured water from a sealed container into 4 cups and set them on the table without being asked. Lily turned a page in her book. Walter put the handheld device in his coat pocket and folded his hands on the table and looked at Joel with an expression that was tired in a way that a person gets tired after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally setting it down. Joel looked at the walls. He looked at the lantern light moving across the mylar and the stored water and the medical supplies and the careful, deliberate preparation of years compressed into this room, and he thought about the 14 towns he had audited before this one, and how none of them had looked like this, and how he had driven into this place on a Tuesday expecting to be done by Thursday, and how the Tuesday version of himself would not have believed a word of what Walter had just told him. He was not the Tuesday version of himself anymore. Joel looked around the room. He thought about Lily looking up from her book when he came in and then going back to reading. He thought about Owen's hand on his arm on the road. He thought about the dinner invitation that had been slipped under his door. He thought about all the ways his family had been ready for him specifically without ever having met him. Outside, the aurora moved across the gaps in the shutters in long, slow pulses of red and green, and the ground held its low vibration, and the world contracted to the size of this room and the people in it, and the careful years of preparation surrounding them all on every side. The vibration in the ground came in waves now, not constant, not dramatic, just a low periodic reminder that something enormous was happening at a scale too large to see from inside a shuttered room in a small Alaskan town. Walter explained that the field collapse would be temporary, that the poles would stabilize on the other side of the shift, that the window of vulnerability was what they were managing, not the end of the world. The end of the world as it had been organized. The distinction mattered, and Walter made it carefully, because he was the kind of man who believed that precision in language was a form of respect for the people you were talking to. Joel listened and nodded and wrote nothing down, because his notebook was in his room at the guest house, and his room at the guest house was a place he was not going to be sleeping in again. He sat at the table in the lantern light and listened to the aurora move outside the shutters and accepted with a quietness that surprised him that the life he had driven into this town to do a 2-day job and drive home from was not the life he was going to be driving home to. He did not know yet what the life on the other side of this room looked like. He knew it started here, in this room, with these people, with the walls they had built and the supplies they had stored in the years of preparation they had made for a moment that had arrived on a morning when the only person in town who had not known it was coming was a state contractor with a dead truck and a notebook full of questions he had finally stopped needing to ask. The power did not come back on that night, or the night after, or the night after that. Joel knew by the end of the first day that it was not going to come back on in any time frame that mattered, and he stopped waiting for it sometime in the early hours of the second morning, when he was sitting in the main room of Owen and Celia's house listening to the shortwave radio cycle through frequencies that were either static or silent. The town had shifted into its prepared state with a smoothness that would have been remarkable if Joel had not spent 4 days watching the infrastructure of that smoothness being revealed to him piece by piece. Every household knew its role. Every family had a set of tasks that began the moment the power went out and continued in a sequence that had clearly been discussed and rehearsed over years. Food inventories were consolidated and logged. Water storage was checked and sealed. Medical supplies were assessed and distributed to the 3 homes that had been designated as treatment points if they were needed. Communication was routed through Walter's shortwave setup, which he had moved to Owen and Celia's house, because it was the most centrally located of the prepared structures and had the best antenna access from its roof position. Joel watched all that happened around him and felt the particular weight of being the only person in a functioning system with no function. He was not in the way. Nobody treated him as a burden or an obligation. Owen gave him tasks when tasks presented themselves, and Celia included him in the routines of the household without making it a point. But the tasks were the tasks of someone being kept occupied rather than someone being kept useful, and Joel recognized the difference. He spent the first 2 days learning the inventory system, and by the 3rd day, he had proposed a reorganization of the supply logging that would make rationing decisions faster and more accurate when the time came for rationing decisions. Brent came to look at the proposed system on the morning of the 4th day. He stood over Joel's work for a long time without saying anything. Then he went to the storage room and came back and handed Joel the key and walked away without a word. Joel held the key for a moment and then went to work. The shortwave radio was the town's only window to the outside world, and Walter managed it with the careful attention of someone who understood that information was a resource that could be depleted just as surely as food or water. He shared what he received with the community in measured amounts calibrated to what people could absorb without losing the steadiness they needed to keep functioning. Joel sat with him on several nights and heard the unfiltered version. The transmissions that came through in those first 2 weeks painted a picture in pieces. A city going silent on the 4th night, another on the 6th, emergency broadcast signals running on backup power, and then going quiet as the backup power ran out. Amateur radio operators transmitting from locations that became fewer and farther between with each passing day. The scale of what was happening outside the town became clearer with every transmission, and clearer was not a comfort. Cities had gone first as Walter had predicted. The cascade failure of the grid had been almost instantaneous in densely populated areas where the infrastructure was most interconnected and therefore most vulnerable. Rural areas with existing off-grid capacity had lasted longer. Some were still transmitting. The voices on those frequencies had a quality that Joel found difficult to listen to without understanding immediately what it cost a person to sound that calm when they were describing what they were seeing. Radiation symptoms appeared in 4 residents during the first week. Walter had anticipated this, and the treatment protocols were written out in a binder that the designated medical point in Owen and Celia's house had been stocked to support. The symptoms were manageable with what they had. Walter had been precise about the supplies needed and the quantities required, and the precision had been enough. Joel helped where he could and stayed out of the way where he could not, and tried Claire on every piece of communication equipment he could access every morning for the first 2 weeks. He tried the shortwave. He tried the satellite phone that one of the other households had in their supplies. He tried frequencies he had no reason to believe she would be monitoring, because trying was the only thing he could do that felt like doing something. The silence from that direction was not the silence of a bad connection or an unavailable line. It was a different kind of silence. The kind that accumulates meaning the longer it goes on. He kept trying because stopping felt like a decision he was not ready to make. Brent was one of the loudest voices in the rationing debates that started in the second week. Not because he was selfish or panicking, but because he had run the numbers more carefully than anyone, and the numbers were not comfortable. The window they had prepared for was running longer than Walter's most conservative projections had estimated. Not catastrophically longer, but long enough that the difference between adequate and insufficient was visible if you looked at the supply logs with the kind of attention Brent applied to them. Joel listened to Brent argue and understood him in a way he had not understood him in the parking lot when Brent had told him to leave. The desperation he had seen in Brent that afternoon had not been about Joel or the audit or even about the event itself. It had been about this. About the numbers, about the possibility that years of careful preparation might not be enough, and that the difference between enough and not enough will be measured in weeks and paid for by the people Brent had spent years trying to protect. Joel did not try to call Claire on the Tuesday morning 3 weeks in. He was at the shortwave at his usual time, and he put his hand on the dial and left it there for a long moment and then took it away and sat back. Owen was across the room and saw it happen and did not say anything. Some things did not need words, and Owen was a person who understood which things those were. Walter found Joel that evening sitting outside on the step of the house in the cold, watching the aurora, which had quieted considerably from the full sky event of the first days, but was still present and still wrong in its colors in ways that a person did not stop noticing just because they had gotten used to seeing it. Walter sat down beside him and said the field was beginning to stabilize. He said the worst of it was passing. Joel nodded, and they sat in the quiet for a moment, and then Joel asked Walter if he had known all along that someone like Joel would end up here when it happened. Walter was quiet long enough that Joel thought he might not answer. Then he said he had hoped so. Joel looked at the aurora and did not say anything else, and Walter did not say anything else, and they sat there in the cold together while the sky did what it was going to do regardless of what either of them thought about it. The days settled into a rhythm that Joel had not expected to find as quickly as he found it. Rhythm was what kept people functional, and the town understood this in a practical way that did not require anyone to say out loud. Mornings began with the inventory check and the shortwave monitoring and the medical assessments of the 4 residents still managing symptoms. Afternoons were for maintenance. The homes needed attention in ways that the cold accelerated and the absence of power tools made slower. Joel learned which tasks his hands were suited for and applied himself to them with the focus of a person who had decided that usefulness was the form his presence here was going to take. He was not going to be a burden. He was not going to be a guest. The key Brent had handed him without a word was the clearest statement of what he was allowed to be here, and he intended to be worth it. He reorganized a full supply inventory over the course of 4 days using a system he built from the compliance frameworks he had spent years applying in a completely different context. The system made the rationing calculations faster and more transparent, and Brent reviewed it twice without comment, and then began using it without being asked. That was the closest thing to an endorsement Joel was going to get, and he understood it and accepted it. The shortwave transmissions thinned as the weeks passed, not because the world outside had gone entirely quiet, but because the voices that had been transmitting were running out of power or running out of reasons, or both. A transmission came in from one of the prepper communities Walter had warned before the event. They were intact and organized and struggling with their water filtration in ways that Walter spent 11 minutes, helping them troubleshoot on the air. The contact went quiet 3 days later and did not return. Walter sat the shortwave for a long time after that, without transmitting, and then closed the log and went to bed. Joel wrote it down in the supply journal he had been keeping since the first week, because writing things down was how he processed them, and had always been how he processed them, and the habit was not something the end of the grid was going to change about him. He found Lily's book on the table in the main room one afternoon when the house was quiet. It was a novel he had not read, and he picked it up and read the back and set it down, and then picked it up again and read the first page standing there at the table. Lily came in from outside with her boot still on and saw him holding it and said he could borrow it if he wanted. He thanked her and took it to his corner of the house and read it over the next several evenings by lantern light. And it was one of the best things that happened to him in those first weeks, and he thought about that sometimes. How the best thing that happened in a particular stretch of days could be a borrowed novel and a lantern and a quiet corner of a well-built house, while the world outside figured out what it was becoming. He was not unhappy. He was not happy either. He was present in a way he had not been present in his life before the audit, and he recognized the quality of it, without entirely understanding where it had come from or whether it would last. He wrote that down too. In the supply journal between the water filtration numbers and the medical assessment notes, he wrote that he was present in a way he had not been before, and that he did not know yet if that was the event or the town or the people in it or all three, and that he intended to find out. The field continued to stabilize over the following days, and Walter tracked it with the same obsessive precision he had applied to watching it destabilize. The numbers moved in the right direction, slowly, unevenly, but in the right direction. The aurora at night became less intense, still present, still wrong in its colors compared to anything Joel had seen before the event, but quieter. The sky was becoming something a person could look at without feeling that the sky itself was trying to tell them something. 3 months after the power went out, the sky was something a person could look at again without flinching, and Walter's field data had stabilized enough that he had stopped checking it every hour and started checking it every morning, which was the closest thing to optimism Joel had seen from him since the first night. The town had found its footing in the way that communities find their footing after something that should have broken them and did not. The losses had been real. 2 residents had not responded to the radiation treatment protocols the way Walter had hoped, and the town had buried them in the frozen ground at the edge of the property line of the easternmost house, and marked the graves with stones from the creek bed. Nobody talked about it constantly, but nobody forgot it either. It was present in the way that real losses are present, in the background of everything, carried rather than displayed. The hard decisions of the first weeks have been made and lived with, and the people who had made them were different on the other side of them in ways that did not wash off and were not meant to. Joel had made some of those decisions alongside Brent, and the making of them together had produced something between them that was not friendship exactly, but was a kind of understanding that friendship sometimes grows out of if both people are willing to let it. The short wave picked up a signal on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd month, not a fragment, not a distress call, running on failing backup power. A clear, organized transmission from a group identifying themselves as moving northeast toward Walter's frequency. They were disciplined in how they communicated. They gave supply status and head count and travel pace and asked for terrain information in a way that suggested they had done this before. Walter responded, and a conversation happened, And when it was over, he sat back on the radio and told the room that the group was one of the prepper communities he had warned before the event. They had lost their shelter to a fire 3 weeks after their last transmission and had been moving toward his signal ever since. The debate about whether to welcome them lasted less time than Joel expected. 3 months of surviving together had done something to this town's understanding of itself, and the answer that came out of the debate was not the answer that fear would have produced. It was the answer that people produce when they have already decided what they believe and just need a question to say it out loud. Joel volunteered to lead the scouting party, and nobody argued with him. It was the first time since he arrived that he had a reason to go back toward the road he had come on, and he did not tell anyone what that meant to him. They left before dawn in 2 vehicles that had been converted to run without the electronics that the event had damaged and drove south on the main road for 2 hours. What Joel saw on that road was the clearest and most complete account of what had happened to the unprepared world that he had encountered since the power went out. He took it in without looking away, because looking away felt like a form of dishonesty he was not willing to practice. He stopped once. At the side of the road, a vehicle sat with its doors open and its contents scattered on the frozen ground around it, as if someone had gone through in a hurry and found nothing worth taking. It had a state government plate on the rear bumper, the same agency Joel had worked for. He stood beside it for a long time looking at the plate and not thinking about anything specific, just standing there. Then he got back in the truck, and they kept driving. When they made contact with the incoming group an hour later, Joel understood immediately why Walter had recognized them from the transmission. They were exhausted and reduced in number from what they had been, and they had the look of people who had been moving for a long time on not enough of everything. But they were organized. They knew what they were doing. They had the specific competence of people who had been preparing for something like this long enough that the preparation had become part of who they were rather than something they did. Brent walked to the front of the scouting party when they pulled up to the incoming group. Nobody had discussed that happening. He just moved to the front without being asked and started talking to the groups, lead the way a person talks to someone they had been expecting. Joel watched him from beside the truck. The desperate contained energy that had defined Brent from the parking lot confrontation, through the rationing debates, through the long, difficult weeks of the first month was gone. What had replaced it was not relief exactly. It was purpose with room in it. The 2 communities drove back to town together, and the process of merging began that afternoon. It was not seamless. Resources were finite, and trust between strangers had to be built from nothing. And there were moments in the first days when the friction of combining 2 groups of people who had each survived something terrible in their own way threatened to produce heat instead of light. But these were people who understood preparation and hard decisions and the cost of wasting either, and they found their footing faster than the situation had any right to produce. Walter spent his evenings at the shortwave, reaching outward into the frequencies. Some nights there was nothing. Some nights there was something. The ratio was slowly improving, and Walter logged every contact with the same meticulous precision he had applied to everything else, and the log was becoming a map of what was still out there and where it was and what it needed. Joel sat with him on those evenings sometimes, and sometimes he sat alone in his corner of the house with the supply journal open and wrote. He wrote about the audit and the compass and the dog facing north and the streetlight and the permits and Brent in the parking lot, and Lily asking her father if it was almost time. He wrote about the dinner at Owen and Celia's and the earthquake nobody reacted to and the aurora filling the sky in colors it had no right to. He wrote about Claire and stopped and sat with a stop writing for a while, and then wrote her name once more and closed the journal. He was sitting outside on the step one evening when the aurora came back. Not the event sky of the first days. Something quieter, pale green along the northern horizon, shifting slowly without urgency, almost familiar. He watched it for a long time. Then he went inside and opened the journal to a fresh page and wrote at the top of it in the plain language he used when he wanted to be honest with himself. He wrote that the world he had driven into this town to audit was gone, and that he knew that completely now and had stopped expecting it to be otherwise. He wrote that what he was helping to build here did not have a name yet, and that the absence of a name did not make it less real. He wrote that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He closed the journal and sat on the table beside the lantern and looked at the pale green aurora through the window for another moment. Then he went to bed. The merged community settled into routines over the following weeks that incorporated the knowledge and skills the incoming group had carried with them across the frozen landscape. They brought expertise in field medicine that supplemented what the town already had. They brought seeds, carefully stored and cataloged seeds for cold climate growing that represented a kind of long view planning that Joel recognized and respected. They brought a radio operator who had been maintaining contact with 2 other surviving communities farther south, and whose frequencies Walter added to his nightly monitoring rotation immediately. The network that Walter had been reaching for since the first night was starting to take a shape that could be described. 2 nodes had become 4. The 4 were in contact and sharing resources and information in a way that was fragile and imperfect and entirely real. Joel applied his logistics background to the task of documenting the network's resource inventory across all 4 locations and building a communication protocol that would let them coordinate without anyone needing to be in charge of anyone else. It was a kind of problem his training had prepared him for, without knowing it was preparing him for the specific version of it. He worked on in the mornings before the rest of the house was fully awake with his notebook and the supplied journal, and the radio log spread across the table, and the pale winter light coming through the small window above the desk. He had been given the desk. Nobody had made a formal announcement about it. It had simply become his desk in the way that things in a functioning community become a person's things over time, without anyone needing to say so. He thought about that sometimes. About how a community that had built everything deliberately and with intention still left room for the unplanned accumulations of belonging. A desk, a corner, a borrowed novel that had never been returned, a key handed over without a word. He thought these were not small things. He wrote that down too. Spring came slowly the way it always came to that part of Alaska, not dramatically. Not as an arrival so much as a gradual loosening of the cold's grip over weeks that required patience to notice. The daylight stretched at both ends of the day, and the frozen ground began to yield in the lowest spots near the creek, and the people who had been inside for months came out in the afternoons and stood in the pale sun, and did not talk much, but stood close to each other in the way that people stand when proximity itself is a thing of value. Joel stood with them. He had stopped being the outsider somewhere in the second month without being able to identify the specific moment it had happened. He was not originally from here and never would be, and everyone knew that, and nobody treated it as a problem. He was the man with the desk and the supplied journal and the logistics framework and the key Brent had handed him, and those things were enough to make a person belong somewhere, if belonging was something a community decided to extend rather than something a person had to earn in the conventional sense. Lily had started asking him questions in the evenings, not about the event or the outside world, or the things he had seen on the scouting trip that he had not described to anyone, about ordinary things, about what other places looked like, and what his job had involved before he drove into this town, and whether he had ever seen the ocean. He answered her questions with the same care that Walter answered questions, precisely, without more or less than what was asked for. He thought she was one of the most perceptive people he had met at any age, and he thought the world that was being built here was lucky to have her growing up in it. One evening in early spring, Walter came and found him at the desk and set a fresh notebook down beside the supplied journal, without saying anything. Joel looked at it and then looked at Walter. Walter said he thought Joel might be running out of pages. Joel looked at the supplied journal, which was indeed nearly full. He thanked Walter, and Walter went back to the shortwave, and Joel opened the new notebook to the first page and sat with a blank page for a moment before he started to write.